Excellent. Thank you all for joining. This is the February 2023 installment of the Microsoft Data Platform Continuity Virtual Group. With us is an absolute pillar in the community, Edwin Sarmiento. The session today is going to be talking about making the most of your existing HA and DR solution in the first quarter of the year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Edwin.
Okay, hopefully my audio is going through. It's challenging to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I don't know exactly where you guys are coming from. The beauty of working in tech is you could be anywhere, you could be everywhere, and also not know where you are. That's funny. Welcome to this presentation. I did this a couple of weeks ago, the week after the new year, mainly because a lot of people are coming out of change freeze period where you have like from North America between a week before Thanksgiving up until after the new year to have all the operational stuff to be business as usual while also minimizing changes to the environment. By the way, my contact information is there. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and I have been doing high availability and disaster recovery ever since I realized that my life is actually revolving around high availability and disaster recovery. I want to say privileged enough to be born and raised in a country where natural disasters are a common thing. Volcanic eruption, normal. Typhoons, flooding, earthquakes, kind of normal. So for us, it's kind of like second nature to just laugh at it, but also being prepared as to when real disasters like those happen. And I didn't realize that until actually my coach asked me, so what is it about you getting into HANDR? Well, oh yeah, right. I grew up in this. Anyway, like I said, I did this presentation in my inner circle the week after New Year, because again, you're coming out of change freeze the week after the new year, or between the time a week before Thanksgiving and after New Year, where you can't do anything. You're not allowed to touch anything. Well, you're allowed to touch something if and when an emergency happens, but then you're not allowed to make any major changes. So a lot of the projects were pushed, a lot of the change implementation are pushed after the change freeze period. And so you kind of have like a lot of breathing room to do what you want to do and what you need to do within the first quarter of the year. Not only that, is because typically in the beginning of the year, people are like excited. You know how people would make New Year's resolution, they want to come up with something, and all of a sudden, hey, these are all the things that we can do throughout the year. So we plan as early as possible in the first quarter of the year. I want to start off, and if you've been to some of my presentations, I always like to start something with a story. And if you can use the chat window, if you're joining us through this presentation and you have access to the chat, I would appreciate interaction. How many of you have had a Sony Walkman before? For those of you who have watched the Guardians of the Galaxy series, they're coming up with volume 3. You probably remember the iconic Sony Walkman that now his name skips me. That iconic Walkman reminded me of when I had that bright yellow Walkman that my dad got me when I was a kid. And it's interesting, the story behind the Walkman is the founder or the chairman of Sony Corporation back then was traveling back and forth between Japan and North America, and he wanted something portable where he can listen to music. And interestingly, he noticed in North America particularly that people wanted to listen to music on the go. He saw a lot of North Americans listen to music on their car, so they have their car stereo. They got this large, remember those times, those analog boom boxes. And what he came up with was he just threw in the idea to his engineers and said, hey, I just want to listen to music while I'm traveling and while I'm on long haul flights. They came up with something, and a lot of the engineers had an idea where, okay, let's build something portable, a little bit bigger than your traditional analog cassette tape. For those of you who remember the analog cassette tape, I still have a box of those right over here. And then created a player, a music player with this. And then lo and behold, another engineer came up with the idea of, hey, why don't I grab one of those headsets, you know, the ones you put overhead, like what David has right now, have an audio jack into this, and they came up with a Walkman. The idea behind this is very interesting because the invention that a lot of people thought back in the 70s or the 80s was something new. It's innovative. But what a lot of people didn't realize back then, and still a lot of people don't realize, is the fact that this is really not a new invention. It's something that came out of already existing items. Think about that for a second. They had everything that they needed right there, and all they did was put them together, kind of like a Lego pieces. You can come up with so many different ideas given the same pieces of Lego. And the idea behind this is that most tech professionals, myself included, I'm not excluding myself from this, we make this very common mistake. We think we need to come up with something new features, new benefits, new this and new that. And the reality is sometimes innovation and creativity spring from the most common things, the things that are already right in front of us, right? So what if we can make something out of what we already have? In fact, this is the whole gist of the presentation today. What if we can make something out of what we already have? And this requires thinking outside of the box and activating our creative side. A lot of people in tech would say, no, I'm highly analytical, I'm not creative. Well, you actually are. The fact that you work in tech and able to solve very complex problems tells me that you are highly creative. My goal for this presentation is that you would come up as a problem solver, somebody who would see opportunities out of what is currently available to you. You would look at what improvements are available for you if you only look deep enough, or do you just analyze and think about what else you can make improvements out of. My goal is also help you become a leader, because when you start initiating things instead of being just satisfied with status quo, you can not only improve your HADR solution, but people will look up to you because you have taken the initiative to do what most people would not even want to do. Of course, it's a communicator, because in order for you to take advantage, or in order for you to take this into an idea into action, you have to communicate it. You have to tell people, your boss, the stakeholders, of the benefits of what this entire thing can provide, as far as not just the technical features and technical solutions that we provide for our HA and DR strategies. How can we make the most out of this while at the same time improving the business? It's very easy to fall into the trap of, hey, let's implement the solution because it's cute, it's new, it's fancy. Like SQL Server 2022 is out. What can we use SQL Server 22 for? Why don't we flip it around and start asking the question, how can we make the most out of our existing HADR solution, which is exactly this. So the first thing, if you got your pen and paper ready, I'm old school, by the way. Still use pen and paper for taking notes. Never underestimate the power of pen and paper, never, because it doesn't run out of battery, doesn't run out of memory. It may run out of space, but I can always grab a legal pad somewhere. First one is to evaluate. And what does this mean? Evaluate whether or not your existing HADR solutions still meet your recovery point, your recovery time, and your recovery objectives. Evaluate. The thing that a lot of people do when they're implementing a new solution is, it works, we've tested it, bye-bye. This is a common scenario that I've seen also with my customers coming in. They bring me in as a consultant, evaluate the entire environment, availability groups, failover clustering, for instance, and it's unstable. We stabilize it to a point where it's so reliable they forgot they have one, because it's not causing issues, it's not causing any outages, and it's humming perfectly, that people forget it's there, right? When your monitoring solution doesn't send you alerts for stuff like, oh, an outage happened or failover happened. But the thing about this is that when you built the solution a couple of years ago or a couple of months ago, we tend to kind of let it be and not reevaluate it 1 year later or 2 years later, or maybe 10 years later, right? I'll give you a very simple example, backups. Of course, I'm assuming that everybody has backups. Yeah, you won old school with pen and paper. Backups, for instance, people talk about backups 50, 60 plus years after the introduction of storage media. We're still talking about backups. We're still using backups, and we're still dealing with backups, right? So the question here is, what about backups? Well, here's the thing. How large are your backups? Oftentimes, when you come in and let's say you're a new DBA in the company or a new sysadmin, because it just so happened that you were sitting next to a database server, you've been voluntold to take care of SQL Server, and then you set up backups. You set up backups, and then you create this, fancy database maintenance plan, whether it's the built-in database maintenance plan or the ones from Ola Hallengren, and then let it rip, it works. You're taking backups, jobs are running successfully. How large are those backups? If you started out with a 500 gigabyte database and your backups are roughly around 200, 300 gigabyte databases, you're fine. Then as the business grows, your backups also grow to the point where now people are looking at, hey, how can we improve our backups? Right? How can we improve our backups? Because the backups have grown so large that now it's taking longer than expected. Typically, when I come in, I would configure a full database backup and a series of log backups. And the only reason I do that is because, for one, most of the time, people don't even know what their recovery point objectives are and what their service level recovery time objectives and service level agreements are. So I just come up with something. That way, if something goes wrong, I have something to go back to. But then it becomes a little bit more of a challenging conversation when you start asking the question, okay, what's the recovery point? What's the recovery time objective? So the database backups or the databases grew as a side effect of the business growing. And then the backups grew. But because the backups are taking longer than what it used to. So for instance, you may have a backup job that runs at 12 o'clock in the morning. And now you kind of expect that it should be done by 1 hour after. Now it's taking 3 hours. Most of the time, companies, DBAs, sysadmins who are taking care of backups will ask, okay, so how do I improve my backup strategy? Because the backups are growing, right? The backup files are growing. How can we improve our backups? So people are looking at, let's stripe the backups and all of these things. Well, again, when you created those backup strategies or backup jobs, the databases were small, and now you haven't considered the backups are growing, and not to mention backups, the databases, the number of databases have increased. So how are we dealing with that? What about how long does it take to restore? I have this controversial opinion about backups. I tell my customers, I don't really believe in backups. I believe in successfully being able to restore from backups, because I couldn't count the number of times when somebody said we have backups. And when I needed to use those backups, they don't work, right? How long does it take to restore from those backups? Your databases are growing, your backups are growing. We tested that the backups work. Well, how do you actually test that your backup works? Well, you restore and you validate and you make sure that when you start the timer and the backups are being restored, that you're still meeting those recovery objectives, right? If your database, again, if your databases back then were like 500 gigabytes and your database backups end up becoming 200 gigabytes or larger, when you restore, how long are those backups going to take to restore, and are they still going to meet your recovery objectives? The common joke that I typically tell people is, yeah, you configured a full database backup and 15-minute log backups So that accounts to around, if I did the math, 96 backups, 1 full and 95 log backups. Have you ever tried restoring 1 full and 95 log backups? Oh, and by the way, time it as well. Like, take out your timer and count the seconds, the minutes, the hours it takes. Even if you automate it, you're still going to have to think about, wait, if I have a 15-minute recovery point objective and an hour recovery time objective, are you sure restoring those 95 log backups together with the full database backup is not going to take an hour? So think about that for a second. How long does it take for you to restore your backups, right? And again, still meeting those SLAs. Are they meeting those SLAs? And even David was mentioning earlier, the business sometimes just say we need a backup, but we haven't really talked about the SLAs. We haven't really have a clear definition of what recovery point objectives are, what recovery time objectives are, and what SLAs are. Sometimes it's tempting to say, oh, we need 0 downtime and 0 data loss. Really? Is the business going to be okay if the database is down for like 4 hours? Then if it is, then you don't need 0 downtime and 0 data loss. We have to have those conversations. And even to the point where you're defining the difference between an HA, RPO, RTO, and SLA versus a DR, RPO, and RTO, and SLA. Okay. And again, I could spend an entire hour talking about backups. Well, what about availability groups, for instance? What about availability groups? Let's say you've implemented an availability group. You have an existing one, 2-node failover cluster with a 2-replica AG. You started out with 17 databases in the AG. And then the question that you need to ask after that is, how long is the failover? How long does it take to do a failover, right? When was the last time you did a failover? If we're dealing with databases that are less than 20 gigabytes or less than 200 gigabytes, and then you're putting 25 databases in an AG, and they're not as busy as most of the highly transactional system, the failover time could take between 15-30 seconds to 2 minutes tops, depending on the capabilities of your database server or CPU, storage, all of these things, number of transaction log records. But then as the company grows, and I keep emphasizing as the company grows, because that's also a side effect of a business growing. Your database is going to grow. The databases that you are going to manage will grow. Question is, how many databases were added to the availability group now that you have the business growing? Is it still 25? Or still, is it now 125? Because the amount of time it takes to fail over an entire AG will depend on a couple of different things, alongside with the number of databases, number of transaction log records, the speed at which your log records are being copied over to the secondary, your storage subsystem, all of these things. And again, when you set up an availability group in the beginning, maybe 4 years ago, everything was fine. But now that the business grew, databases were added to it. Does the RTO for HA is that still being met when it comes to your HA solution, like an available group? How's that? How is your AG failover time meeting those recovery objectives? How many databases? I talked about this. Again, it's tempting because you may have seen Microsoft documentation say, oh, 100 databases, we're fine. Well, that's according to their internal resources, meaning the amount of money, the amount of engineering people, the amount of resources that they have, and then what they've managed to test. I've seen data availability groups where databases go beyond 100 and they say, oh, we're fine. But the real question there is, when was the last time you evaluated whether or not your existing availability groups still meet your existing recovery point, recovery time, and service level agreements? Okay. And this is a little bit of a controversial thing, because for one, when you start introducing something like a third-party solution into the mix, it starts complicating stuff even more, because now you need to make sure whatever third-party solution that you're introducing into the mix is not going to complicate the way you restore stuff. Okay. For instance, when you designed your backup solution 5 years ago, you decided, hey, we are all going to stay with native backups for SQL Server. If it's running on VM, maybe we can have a DR strategy that will rebuild the VM, rebuild the SQL Server instance, install it from scratch, install cumulative updates, service packs, and then restore from backups. And you were fine with that because it meets the business requirements. 5 years down the road, the company is growing. The CIO or the VP of technology decides, let's introduce a third-party solution like Veeam, for instance, or Zerto, and incorporate that in the mix. How is that going to meet the business requirements? Meaning, when you were testing or when you were designing your backup solutions back then, again, I'm tying everything back together. When you were designing those backups a couple of years ago, this third-party solution was not in the picture. Now that it is in the picture, most of the time what I see customers do is they would test a third-party solution the way the third-party solution is meant to be used. But then they forget you're adding a third-party solution on top of what you already have. So the question there is, have you tested your third-party solution? Let's say, for instance, you're using something like Zerto for taking a DR approach. Have you tested that third-party solution with the existing DR solution, like backups, for instance, that you have from way back when? Because you're now complicating a lot of these strategies, and you are incorporating a lot of different technologies, different approaches, while at the same time thinking about whether or not this still meets your objectives. Okay, do they still fit in your DR process? Like I said, when you created your DR strategy back then, there was no such thing as a third-party solution in the mix, and now you're introducing another variable. And when you're testing an existing solution mixed with another solution that's totally different from what you've had, it introduces a lot of these complexities. Interestingly, and again, I'm speaking from hearing these certain scenarios from customers where, let's say, for instance, third-party solutions, you call them and say, hey, this thing doesn't work. And then when they ask for what you currently have, they say, oh, you have this, and this. Oh, that's a Microsoft thing. And then the back and forth between the third-party vendor versus Microsoft versus the hardware versus the virtualization platform, that in itself, and being on a conference call with them, all of a sudden just takes up a lot of your time that you're actually blowing past your recovery time objective. So just evaluating whether or not your existing HA, DR solutions still meet your current recovery point, recovery time objectives, and your service level agreements. I keep going back to all of these things because, for one, the more that the business grows, the more that data is being accumulated, the more that people tend to forget that your recovery point and recovery time objectives still remain. You don't all of a sudden have more hours in a day just because your database grew to a couple of terabytes, right? They still remain the same. So it's either you reevaluate your existing solution or you reevaluate whether or not your recovery point, recovery time objectives are still realistic. Otherwise, you're going to end up trying to meet unrealistic objectives. The second one is to modernize. Now, I don't want to sound like somebody who's just throwing corporate speak here, but modernize is simply an opportunity to improve your existing HADR solutions. And I say opportunity to improve, not from the point of view of let's put in something new, right? Again, the common mistake that a lot of us tech professionals make is that let's think of a new way, but rather think of how can we improve our existing HADR solutions. I use Microsoft as an example here because they, the way they do things is really impressive. I go back to the days of when always on available groups was introduced. I think I almost got into trouble with Microsoft marketing when I started telling customers that this is actually not new, because the reality is it's really not new. We've had failover clustering since Windows NT 4, 99, 98, when Wolfpack was introduced. We've had database mirroring since SQL Server 2005 Service Pack 1. All that Microsoft did was put 2 and 2 together and came up with always on available groups, plus a more expensive SQL Server Enterprise Edition license. But the thing is, a lot of these features that Microsoft is introducing and bringing to the market are a side effect of what they've already done. I'll give you another example. What was that? Online, partial online index rebuilds. When you think about it, filtered indexes were introduced back in SQL Server 2008, and the partial online index rebuild was introduced in SQL Server 2014. They already have the mechanism in place to introduce something like partial indexes in the form of filtered indexes, and now they're introducing something like, okay, let's rebuild indexes based on a subset of this. That way, we're not locking the entire table. The point is, they're making new things out of what is already available. And again, most common mistake that most people make is that when they think of modernization, that okay, let's do a new version or let's do upgrades. Although there may be some merits to that. For instance, upgrading. If you're still running on SQL Server 2005, might be a good reason for you to upgrade, because for one, you're no longer in under mainstream support, or if you want to be officially supported, that's going to cost you a lot. Not saying you should stay in SQL Server 2005, but there's merits to upgrading to later versions, right? And also asking and evaluating whether or not you have software assurance, because you may qualify for a free SQL Server Enterprise Edition upgrade without having to pay extra because you're already paying for software assurance. But think about that for a second. Upgrading your operating system because it's no longer supported, or upgrading your SQL Server version because it's not officially supported. I mean, we were just talking about SQL Server 2012 being out of mainstream support. Yeah, I think it was 2012. And as newer versions are being introduced, you have to think about whether your version of Windows and your version of SQL Server is still supported. And also thinking about, wait, can I do them both at the same time? Right? I'm not a big fan of delaying operating system upgrades and then doing the SQL Server upgrades later on, because, well, for one, you're going to do it anyway. So might as well do it in one shot. It's also one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of doing in-place upgrades, because I can do both operating system and SQL Server upgrades in one shot. And if that thing goes south, I can always go back to my my old production environment. But the thing is, again, if upgrading to the later version of Windows and SQL Server would provide you with the ability to meet your overall recovery point and recovery time objectives, then it's worth the effort of doing it, right? It could be also as simple as consolidating stuff. Virtualization has become kind of like a go-to approach when it comes to consolidation. Like, we'll build a very powerful machine, we'll license the entire machine, and then we'll run as many VMs as we possibly can, all in the name of lowering down licensing and hardware costs. But there could be merits to this. There could be merits to putting your databases in an availability group instead of having database sprawl and having to maintain, secure, patch, and also, by the way, put everything in a high availability solution, right? What else? Migration could be something as simple as moving from an old hardware to a new hardware because your old hardware is already out of support. You need to do a hardware refresh, or it could be as complex as let's move to the cloud. I'm not saying you should without really doing a quick analysis of what the business needs, but understanding that if the business is evolving and you are collecting as much data as you possibly can, and whatever you have on premises is no longer sufficient, or you don't have enough expertise in-house to support a high availability solution, or DR solution for that matter, where you can have multi data center setup, why not put it on the cloud, right? Or it could be as simple as process improvements. Because again, most of the time we're fixated on what feature can we implement, how can we do this? Maybe it's a process improvement that you need to modernize. And what I mean by that is, again, a lot of people may still be using database maintenance plans for their backups. Maybe you want to standardize it and use all the Hallengren scripts. That way, you know how everything is set up, you know how the backup strategies are being done, and you can standardize on putting all of your database backups on a central location. And this is not even going to cost you anything, because for one, it's cheaper. I don't want to say cheaper, but it is more effective to start evaluating. And if you notice, I keep going back to evaluation and modernization as well. It is more effective to evaluate your existing processes versus just trying to implement something new. Typical example that I keep encountering here is, oh, we need to take database snapshots, and it's taking this much time, and it's taking a lot of space. What can we do, right? What can we implement as part of our HA and DR strategy? Oh yeah, availability groups. We got a lot of databases. That's going to cost us a lot. And the conversation is now being geared towards the solution, the technology, without really evaluating, wait, can we improve anything in our existing process so that we can take advantage of what we currently have? I remember a client that I worked with a couple of years ago, where part of their implementation is to do data processing overnight. And the thing is, there are a couple of problems that they were trying to solve there. For one, they were processing an entire data warehouse, about 24 terabytes size data warehouse, that they need to process within overnight, so that by the time it's 8 o'clock, it's ready to serve the business stakeholders and be ready for reporting and analytics. That is already taking longer than 12 hours. Second, their database backups are interfering with the data processing, and now their database backups are also taking longer. And number three, they have a lot of stuff in there, and just processing an increasing amount of data, if they do the projection, would take longer than 12 hours. And the only question that I asked was, so why are you processing the entire data warehouse? Yeah, crickets. They don't know. And asking questions and being very, very clear about why they're doing what they're doing got us into not a new technology, not a new storage solution where it could be all flash array, and they could have a lot of IOPS so that they can process the data faster. Oh, and by the way, also another all flash storage subsystem where they can. We didn't even do anything of that. All we did was, well, why don't you just process a subset of your data and just store that into more of a kind of like a data mart of some sort? And again, this is one of those things where it's easy to jump into a technical solution by providing a technical alternative and not look at improving processes, right? Patching, it could be as simple as patching. Look at this, the Windows version, the SQL Server version. Maybe you haven't installed the latest cumulative updates within in the last 6 months, and now you're a couple of CUs behind. Because again, the reality is, if you open a case with Microsoft, the first thing that they would ask is, did you install the latest cumulative updates? Okay, it could be as simple as that, right? And it could be it could be complicated as new feature implementation. sometimes because we are carrying over some of the things that we've learned from previous versions, we kind of just go with it and not evaluate existing versions and existing features. One customer I had, they had an 8-node Windows Server failover cluster stretched across 2 different data centers, and they were seeing a lot of outages. And the thing is, they're already using Windows Server 2016 with SQL Server 2016, but their implementation of their existing infrastructure was born out of the previous sysadmin who designed a failover cluster, and so they relied so much on that. And I told them, look, there's this new feature in SQL Server 2016 called distributed availability group, and this would solve about 70 to 80% of your latency issues, outage issues. And again, just because their old sysadmin or their old architect designed it in such a way doesn't mean that it's going to be like that for the rest of the database lifecycle. It requires, again, going back to evaluating your existing infrastructure or existing solution and then modernize it. There are a lot of available features in SQL Server that all you have to do is take some time, look at it, evaluate it, and then test it, and then implement it, because the feature is already there in the first place. No extra licensing, no extra cost other than you putting the time and putting the effort into making the most out of the resources that you have. Okay. Again, it's a modernization is a loaded term, because most of the times people in the business or corporate people would talk about, yeah, let's do upgrades and do cloud. No, evaluate, going back to my point, the first point, evaluate what you already have, and maybe you have something in there that you could improve. Okay, evaluate, modernize, and the third one, which is very, and of course, don't just do this just because you heard me say it. Okay, it's a common misconception, and it's also a common mistake. Some CIO or CTO attended a conference and heard somebody say, you do this and implement this, and all of a sudden they go back to work and then they implement the very same thing that they heard. Use your monitoring tools. Your monitoring tools will tell you exactly, of course, the assumption there is, of course, you have monitoring tools. Your monitoring tools will give you the data. It will give you the facts to allow you to make these decisions. What do I mean by that? Consolidation, every time I'm looking at a consolidation project, I would look at the monitoring tool and say, hey, you know what? This particular SQL Server instance is not that busy. You need a database anyway. Why don't we port this over to this existing availability group or this existing failover cluster instance, so you no longer have to manage 2 separate systems, just one, right? Start moving the databases, and then you do all of these things, even as simple as, hey, let's do a quick inventory of the entire environment and see what systems out there need to have their operating system patched, need to have SQL Server updated, maybe missing cumulative update. And again, use your monitoring tools to make these decisions. You already have the data anyway. Even when people are saying, well, how long is my backup going to take? Well, you have your SQL Server agent job history, you have your backup history, you have your monitoring tools. Use the data that you already have in order to make these improvements. Most importantly, and I cannot underestimate the importance of having the right staff. Do you have enough to be fully covered? And I'm not just talking about having a 24/7 highly available system, where you need to be 100% 24/7 covered. Okay. Typically, when somebody decides, hey, we want to implement an HA solution like a failover clustering, an availability group, or stretch cluster, typically somebody would implement that, build it, design it, roll it out in production, but not thinking about the operational aspect of it. How many times have you been, and again, you could put it in chat, window, how many times have you been in a situation where somebody built the HA or the DR solution, and now you're supposed to take care of it without any clue at all how they did it, how it's supposed to work, and how you're supposed to keep the lights on, right? Do you have enough? Countless, you want to say countless, you'll be surprised. Do you have enough to be fully covered? When customers come to me and say, we want this, we want a 3-node failover cluster with a 3-replica AG, 2-in-1 data center and 1 another data center, the very first question I ask, in addition to the recovery point, recovery time objective conversation, is how many people on your team actually know how to do this? Yeah, crickets, because they are still learning in the process. So if nobody knows how to do this, how do you expect to support it? I mean, it's all, it's all fun and games, it's all fancy designing, building, and then rolling it out in production. I've seen it so many times where, again, a managed services provider would come in, or an external consultant, or a senior guy who used to work for the company, built something, they designed it, they tested it, rolled it out in production, and then they left. I was just having a conversation with an Oracle architect who was working with a colleague who was his SQL Server counterpart. The guy is supposed to retire tomorrow. So now he's left with so many things that his colleague took care of, designed, implemented, rolled out in production, and now he has no clue at all how to deal with it, right? Do you have enough to be fully covered? And I'm looking at both operation and escalation, because at the end of the day, you're going to be rolling it out in production, and you're going to be supporting the operation, okay? Also, you don't want to be in a situation where you're the only person who knows how to deal with this, because for one, if you're the only person who knows how to deal with this, you're going to become the bottleneck. Meaning, if something happens, you need to carry your phone with you, you need to carry your pager with you. Oh, and by the way, you need to be 24/7 available. It's a recipe for burnout. We're not even talking about that. Sometimes you're talking, again, the conversation revolves around, let's implement this feature, let's have a high availability solution, let's have a disaster recovery solution, let's do this. And by the way, we POC'd it, it works and fine, but how many people are available to support it? Oh, by the way, not to mention how many people are capable and available to support it, because there's a big difference between available and capable and available. You can be capable, but you're not available, right? You might be the senior escalation guy in the team, but then you're in the Bahamas going on vacation, or maybe you're in Vegas somewhere because you are attending a company event and somebody else has to be back in the office taking care of this, okay? You do have enough people. And I'm not just referring to people on your team, because with outsourcing and people and companies outsourcing to managed services providers, they have to be part of this. They need to know your internal processes. They need to know what they need to do if something goes wrong, right? Do they have the right skills to do the job? Like I said, there's a big difference between available and capable. When you turn a standalone instance into an available group or a failover clustered instance, you're now responsible for making sure that you have 24/7 coverage. Now you might be thinking, well, we don't need 24/7. Well, why do you turn it into an HA solution if you don't need 24/7 coverage? That's why you need to go back to evaluating whether or not the high availability or disaster recovery solution is actually what you need. If you don't need it, then make it simple. Maybe a standalone solution would be enough for you. But again, there's a big difference between available and capable. I've seen it a lot of different times, and I can maybe Yuan would agree to this. I've seen cases where they have level 1, level 2, and level 3 engineers. Level 1 are the people who would take care of the tickets as they come in. Level 2 will be the ones where these tickets need to be escalated. And if the level 2 people cannot resolve the issue, level 3 will step in and try to resolve the issue. Oftentimes, the level 1 people will just create the ticket and escalate without even reading it. Sometimes the ticket ends up on a different queue because they just escalated it without reading. I think we need to introduce reading comprehension in IT, because sometimes reading the error message gives us exactly what we need to do. I digress. But again, they need to both be available and capable, right? They need to be both available and capable. It's interesting to see senior escalation people get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning because level 1 and level 2 didn't know what to do, right? And like I said, I see this oftentimes when somebody came in, they designed it, they implemented it, but there was no handover, there was no proper turnover done. And so you're there, you might be in that situation where you're trying to pick the pieces apart and trying to reverse engineer things and figure out what they did and all these things, while at the same time trying to resolve an outage. It's nerve-wracking to be in a position where, or you're supposed to be the person taking care of this, but you don't know exactly how to deal with it because you don't have any clue how the thing works. So you have to have both available people and capable people. It cannot be an or thing. They have to be capable and available. Because what good is available if they're not capable? What good is capable if they're not available? Just saying, yeah, service desk backlog. Oh, Ewan, I feel you, because I'm pretty sure you have been reading countless tickets that could have been resolved if people read the ticket. What else? Do you have a backup? Do you have a backup? I'm not referring to database backups or snapshot. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to a person, someone who can be your backup. In a typical disaster recovery, even if you have the perfect technology solution, document, run book, everything, in a real disaster, what people often forget is none of this matter if the person in the disaster situation is not in the right state of mind. I've seen so many senior escalation engineers way smarter than I am. They have more degrees, they have more experiences, but because they've never been in a real disaster, they've never done DR exercises, they freeze. And they don't know how to do. They know what to do. And again, it's just human nature. We've never considered human behavior in our disaster recovery exercises. And I remember, man, there's so many stories there. I remember there was one case when we had it was supposed to be a disaster recovery exercise. I was still a data center engineer working for a global tech company. And we were doing this DR exercise. We had our storage vendor come in, we had a third-party vendor come in, and we were having this DR exercise because we are mandated by the government to have quarterly DR exercises. Unfortunately, as we were having DR exercises, a real disaster happened. All of a sudden, we lost power, data center went down. And it's interesting to see how people all of a sudden responded just because they were in a real disaster situation. One of the things that I do in my always on, one of the things that I do in my SQL Server always on availability groups, the Senior DBA Field Guide training class, is I would simulate a real disaster right in front of everybody and just ask them, what would you do? And sometimes they would not even respond. 4 minutes and ask them, are you okay? If I sometimes just, wow, this is the first time I'm seeing it live and I have no clue how to respond, despite the fact that we have been doing this. And again, in the same way you would ask firefighters, you would ask people in the military, they would train, they would rehearse, they would go on these training exercises on a regular basis, but hoping and praying they're not going to get deployed to war, they're not going to be doing, because it's different. That's one of the reasons why even the people who trained for years sometimes are not in the right state of mind. They freak out because, again, it's just human nature, right? Have someone not only who knows what you can do, but also knows how to respond properly in a real disaster. Someone who can back you up. And they need to know what the documentation says. I mean, the DR documentation, what the process is. And if they've never done it before, this is the perfect opportunity for you to start reeling them in, getting them familiar with how the process works, how the technology works, and run them through worst case scenarios. Of course, unless you kind of do this on a regular basis, of course, I don't expect you to do this on a regular basis unless you work for Microsoft, and which happens to be the thing that they do on a regular basis. But just get someone ready. Okay, not just by title, but by skill level. And more importantly, the way they think and their natural response in a real disaster. Okay, you gotta have someone as a backup, right? I joke around the fact that I may be a high availability expert, but I'm not highly available. I like my sleep. I like to go on vacations. I like enjoying my holidays. I like spending time with family. I like to eat. So you cannot be 24/7 available for a 24/7 system. You got to staff for it. You got to have people who are capable and available at the same time, and also have the right mindset and the right psychology to deal with a real disaster. So, wrapping this up, I didn't realize these were my initials. Now that I think about it, they're my initials. Evaluate. You already have an existing HADR solution, whether it's as simple as backups. If you have a database mirroring thing, it's maybe deprecated, but it's still supported. And a lot of the time, people would jump into always on availability groups because it's new, it's no, you don't have to. If you don't have the right skills, or if you don't have the capabilities to support that, stay with what you currently have, and then plan for that, going to the modernized thing, plan for that in the future. Once you've evaluated whether your existing HADR solutions don't meet your recovery time objectives, or whatever the business requires, time for you to modernize, even update your processes, update your strategies, plan for consolidation, all of these things, while at the same time staff for it. Because again, a standalone instance does not have the same requirement as a an HA solution that requires 24/7 care and feeding, right? The goal, of course, is to stabilize an environment where you don't really have to touch anything other than during a change management process, like installing patches or performing regular maintenance. But again, the goal is to stabilize and make a high availability solution to be highly reliable, so that you don't have to deal with it. But again, don't fall into this trap of thinking, oh, it's stable, it's reliable, I don't have to really do anything about it. Think of yourself as a firefighter who needs to rehearse for when that real emergency or when that real disaster comes in, you're ready. I am going to open up the floor for questions now, and oh, I'm on time. If you have any questions, feel free. We have a little bit more time to taking your questions. I'm going back to some of the people who are typing in the chat. Maybe they posted questions in there.
I haven't seen any questions yet, but I can tell all of you that everything Edwin is talking through here is absolute gold. The best availability solution with the worst planning is nothing more than an expensive space heater.
And I remember the conversation we had last month with the Q&A panel. And I think it was Eleanor who said, 30 years later, we're still solving the same problems that we solved before. They just appear to be different. It's just different variation, but we're still solving the same problems. But it's also interesting because again, the default, most tech professionals, I'm not excluding myself, our default is to look for a new way of doing things versus just reevaluating what we already have and making the most out of it. So,
yeah, well, it reminds me of the urban myth back in the space program, space race in the 60s. The U.S. spent millions developing a space pen. The Russians made a pencil. Yeah, things like that. And it's like I build HADR solutions all day long, every day. And yeah, a lot of cases, we don't need anything fancy. It's a great question here. How do we conduct these sanity checks? And how do you conduct a sanity check for a backup staff member? It's a great question.
okay, I just want to make sure that I'm not on mute. Great question, Ewan. How do you conduct these sanity checks? Are we talking about sanity checks for the person or sanity checks for the environment? It's interesting. You hang out on these, platforms like Stack Exchange, Microsoft Answers, on Reddit, and when people ask these questions, like what solution do I use, and you go back to asking the question, what is your ultimate goal? Takes them a while to really come up with something. And being clear on what the real goal is solves most of your problem. So if you want to do these sanity checks, the first thing that you need to do is go back to answering the question, what is the real goal? What is that? Anything that you need to do should pass the goal check. Oh, we're building a distributed availability group between AWS and Azure, and we want it to be active. We're primary replica on node 1, and then you have a secondary replica, which is also hosting a primary replica of another 8. What's the goal? What is the goal? This is the ultimate sanity check. What is the goal, right? And then there's a best suitable for a backup person. Sometimes the business does not see the value of having another person to cover. They would say, no, IT is a cost center and it's an additional cost. But until you start communicating the value, remember what I mentioned earlier, the real goal of this presentation is to allow you to become both, to become a problem solver, a leader, and a communicator. You need to communicate the value of whatever backup, whatever HA, whatever DR solution you're using to the business, right? Some businesses would say, oh, we only need it for compliance reasons. Well, part of the compliance reasons is meeting those objectives. And if one person cannot meet those compliance requirements, then we're toast. It's the ability to communicate to the business that you need a backup person, right? What happens? Throw them worst case scenarios. And sometimes they would also push back on hiring another person. So now you can throw them the idea of, hey, why don't we find somebody who's already on the team that could be my backup? Now, not necessarily we're going to give him more work to do, but maybe we can share the workload. Or maybe 3 people that we can bring up to speed and become part of our quote unquote HADR team, so that we can then spread the workload. Again, the last thing you want is to be the only person on call for a 24/7 system. And when the time comes that you need to get to sleep, you need to get some sleep, you can't. Right? So you have to sell that idea. You have to communicate the reason why you want somebody as a backup. Does that make sense?
Works for me. Definition of done to compliance noted. I like that.
And again, this is also one of those reasons when people would say, and don't get me wrong, I also fall into this trap of, hey, let's just do this. It's fun. I've seen cases where DBA sysadmins, architects would build something, design something with their main goal is to put something on their resume and prove to the whole world that they could do it. Let's go back to the real reason why we need to do it in the first place. I will be the first one to say, don't do it if it doesn't meet your business objectives. And again, going back to compliance, they would say, oh, it's to check a box. Well, if we're just checking a box, what prevents us from not doing it and just showing people that we just check the box, right? It's operating out of that integrity where, yeah, we just need to check a box versus I need to do my job right. And we are stepping out. And one of the reasons I like HANDR is not because of the tech, it's the process and the people thing. And oftentimes you would see people who would say, no, let's not, let's cut corners. And I would directly tell my customers, if you're willing to cut corners on this, then what else are you willing to cut corners on? And I don't think I can work with you on that. It's also defining what you're capable of. And remember what I said in the beginning, problem solver, being leader, and communicator. You have to set yourself apart as a leader that would tell either your boss or even the vendor says, this is not the right thing to do. And I'm sorry. That goes my Canadian approach. I'm sorry, but I cannot back you up on this. Right. So you have to take a stand, put your stake in the ground and say, this is not the right thing to do. So
that's great.
Any other question from other people who are in here? I see Chris, Tim, Matt, Adam, Jeff. How are you, Jeff?
Sweet. I think we are good. If anybody watching this after the fact from YouTube or anybody watching the session live has any further follow-up questions for Edwin, please do not hesitate. Contact him here. If you have any questions for us with running the group here, or if there's a session you'd like to see down the road, let us know. A lot of us are absolute nerds with this kind of stuff. We have a lot of fun. And quite frankly, if there's a session that you have in mind that you'd like to see more of, don't hesitate to give us the topics. A lot of us will be happy to put a session together for you. Plus, if it's something we haven't considered or haven't thought of, we definitely want to go do the exploration and come up with some better ways to do a lot of these things. It goes to a lot of what we do with consulting over here. It's making the most of what you've got. If what you've got is total trash, then maybe we need to scrap the whole thing. But most of the time, we can do a lot more with the existing investment you've made with both time, licensing, infrastructure, all the above. You can squeeze more out of this stuff, be it HADR, performance tuning, operational stability, all kinds of good stuff. So
Chris was saying something very practical advice. I actually do this on a weekly basis goes out on my LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter accounts. I call it the Practical SQL Server HADR show, because what good is your HADR solution if you're not practical about it? I mean, having a high availability solution is already expensive. Let's just be practical about it.
Exactly. Exactly. Be practical, be reasonable, test, verify, have redundancy. I'd love to be able to take a vacation here or there. We're running the same challenges over here. A lot of people call us for a lot of the hard stuff, and it is difficult to sift out from underneath that some days.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up if there's no further questions. If you're watching this on YouTube later on today or whenever, if you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out to Edwin or us over here. And thank you very much. We'll see you for the next one.
Thanks, everyone.